I'm Raphael Simon, and this is Go Time.
It's Go Time, a weekly podcast where we discuss interesting topics around the Go programming language, the community, and everything in between. If you currently write Go or aspire to, this is the show for you. All right, everybody, welcome back for another episode of Go Time. It is episode number 7. Today we have Brian Kettleson here with us. Say hello, Brian.
Hello.
And Carlisa Campos is also here.
Glad to be here. Hi, everybody.
And we also have a special guest here with us, Raphael Simon, who is the creator of a framework called Goa for generating APIs, which Brian is particularly excited about.
Hello.
You want to give us a little bit of background, Raphael?
Sure. Yeah. So let's start with who am I? So I'm a platform architect at RightScale. RightScale is a cloud management platform. I've been working there for almost 8 years. And when I started, the whole product was basically a single raise app. And the platform has grown a lot since then. And last time I counted, there were about 52 different services running in production, running on about 1,000 VM. So I've helped design, develop, and debug a lot of them. And part of going from this single raise app to all those distributed services, we felt a lot of pain in having to design APIs the right way. What I mean by that is being able to come up with APIs that are consistent and have standards that are enforceable. So, so that we can come up and say, yep, that API looks good. It follows our standards, and we'd be able to integrate that service with the rest of the fleet. And as you probably know, once an API is alive, it's almost impossible to change it. Once you have customers that start using it, or once your internal services rely on it, then that API is going to be alive forever. So it is very important that you spend the time designing it properly. And when we looked at what was available to do that, there just wasn't much. There were a few tools here and there, but nothing that we felt would be enough for us. So we ended up creating a framework. At the time, that framework was in Ruby called Praxis, that basically allowed you to write that design in code, and then the framework would leverage that design at runtime. And fast forward, RightScale kind of shifted towards Go, and I thought it would be good to see if we could do something like that in Go. And to be honest, I wasn't sure initially that would be possible. So I played around with a few things, and it took me about a year really to come up with something that started to look like it may work. And so there were two big aha moments in that kind of research phase. One was the realization that code generation was the perfect approach for achieving the goal of keeping the design and implementation separate while making sure that the design is directly enforced. And the second realization was that the design should be written in a DSL so that the language used to describe the API use the right terms, right? You want to talk about resources, actions, responses, requests, and you don't want to have to deal with programming language artifacts. So that DSL would have to be a Go DSL, obviously, so that it could be understood right away, and also so that it's still possible to use the Go language when it's needed. So fast forward like a year and a half, and I have to say that the result turned out a lot better than I thought it would be. And I think a lot of the credits goes to the Go language. The Go language provides very simple and powerful mechanism to create that DSL. It also has very good code analysis support, which is essential, and very good code generation packages, the template package in particular. So all of that put together, I think we end up today with something that is actually very interesting, and we've started using Goa fairly extensively here at RightScale.
No, so that's great. So just kind of like a high level detail. So Goa is a framework for using kind of DSL that's written in Go to generate HTTP APIs.
Yep, yeah, exactly. And it from that design, from that DSL, which is Go code with basically the DSL, you can think of it as a lot of package level functions that you invoke and that are recursive. So you call a top level function, let's say called API, and you then embed other function calls in it, where you define every single property of the API, like the title, the description, etc. So when you look at it, it's actually not too ugly. You can actually understand it very well and follow what it's trying to do. And from that design, what happens is when you load the design, when you start the process that has that package linked in, because all of that design code lives in global variable, the Go runtime takes care of running all of that for you, and you end up with a lot of in-memory data structures that describe your API. And those are simple, nothing special Go data structures that you can look at, inspect, and use to generate pretty much anything. So it's quite nice because you start from a language that is easy to use from a human point of view, and you end up with data structures that are very nice to handle from a programmatic point of view. And so Goa comes with a few built-in code generation outputs. One is the glue code that bridges the low-level HTTP server with the user-provided handlers. And that code takes care of validating the incoming requests according to the validation rules described in language. It also builds convenient data structures for accessing the request state and writing the response. So you end up with code that you have to write as the user, which is very small, right? You don't have to do all the validation that you usually have to do, and you don't have to bind the request body to some data structure. All of that is done already. You end up with what is called a context data structure, and that data structure has everything laid out in a way that's very easy for you to access and consume. So you could end up very terse and very clean. The GoAgen tool that comes with Goa, which is the code generation tool, also generates a client package and a client tool. So that's also been very neat because one issue is when you create an API, obviously the point is for the API to be consumed, and what tends to happen is that every team consuming the tool will develop their own client, and they will all become out of date, and they will all have small discrepancies, and things start creeping up, which make the whole thing more difficult to evolve. And so having that being generated automatically means that the team that provides the API also provides the client, and everybody uses that one client. And so it makes everything consistent, and it helps other teams consume the API. And GoAgen also generates documentation in the form of a Swagger and JSON schema, so that you can, at any point in time, share the design to other people that may not be familiar with the Goa DSL, and you can use that also to document the API once it's in running production. So all of that makes for a very nice way of developing APIs, and very efficient way of doing it.
So I have two comments. I found Goa in October, November, I guess, of last year. And two things struck me immediately when I saw Goa. The first was that the generated code looked handwritten. And I have to commend you for that, because for me, that was the most impressive part of the project, was that all other code generation facilities I've seen before, it's really clear that it's generated code. And it doesn't feel idiomatic. It doesn't feel like Go. It feels like somebody generated some Go code. So having that generated code in Goa look so handwritten was very impressive for me.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that was definitely a design goal. I was, when I started Go, I was a little bit not afraid, but I was a little bit worried about the reception that the Go community would have, because I know that the Go programmers are very not picky, but they like the Go code to be idiomatic. They like a certain way. They like the code to look a certain way and behave a certain way. And so I didn't want the generate code to be an issue. Basically, I wanted that to be a non-issue. I wanted people to look at it and say, "Yeah, okay, it looks good enough. I don't have to. It's not terrible." And so I definitely try to put some efforts to make that a non-issue for the adoption of Goa. Yep.
Now, speaking of the kind of idiomatic Go and reception from the community, what's the reception like for the actual DSL itself? Because I've seen the generated code, which I think is highly idiomatic. But I don't know whether the DSL is so much. Do you get a lot of slack about that, or are people pretty comfortable with that?
So there's been a few comments on the repo and GitHub of people trying to make it look more like Go, but then I'm always very I kind of have a hard line saying this is not Go. It's a DSL. It's a different language. It's implemented in Go, but it's not Go. So, for example, one thing that you sort of have to do when you use DSL is use dot imports, right? And a lot of people don't like that. And I agree. I don't think dot imports are good either. I think if you write Go code, you shouldn't use them, and nothing else in Go uses that. But for the purpose of implementing a DSL, that ends up being making the whole thing a lot nicer, feel a lot more natural. And so there is a little bit of that pushback, but then my response is, well, this is not Go, and I'm not trying for DSL to be idiomatic Go because it's not Go in the first place. And if you think about it, some of the target outputs for the DSL is documentation. There's also a JavaScript client that you can generate from that DSL. And in the future, there can be plugins written to generate clients in other languages. And so the language has to be agnostic, right? It has to remain independent of any target that it generates. And sure, Go is the main target for sure, but still the language should try to remain as agnostic as possible.
Right. So people just need to disconnect a little better, right? It's kind of like gRPC, right? The DSL is essentially the protobufs, right? And then the generator generates from that. And yours just happens to be.
Yep.
So yeah.
Yep. Yeah, it's like if you write Swagger, then it's completely different from your programming language. It's the same idea. Yep.
Well, that leads me to the second thing that I noticed about Goa, which was the approachability of the DSL. I've seen many DSLs in the past. Being a former Ruby developer, it's everything we did in Ruby was a DSL in one way or another. Uh-huh. So seeing a DSL in Go that was approachable and understandable was really surprising for me. I had seen the test frameworks. Which one is it? Ginkgo, Gomega, one of those that uses a similar approach. And it still just didn't really click with me until I played with Goa, and I really enjoyed the readability factor of the DSL in Goa.
Thank you. Yeah, that took a while to get right. And actually, it's funny you mentioned Ginkgo and Gomega because they were definitely a big inspiration for the Goa DSL. I went through different iterations. One iteration, I was using literal data structures to define a DSL, and it was ugly. It was very ugly. And I think it clicked once I saw the trick of basically having an anonymous function being an argument, right? That's really the trick. Once you see that, once you understand that, then everything kind of falls together. Then it's easy to sort of embed those function calls and make it look like it's just a series of instructions, which is nice. Yeah, but that took a while.
So, what has surprised you most about the explosion of Goa adoption?
I was very, very impressed by how the Go community and you especially really embraced Goa. I didn't think, it was more of a sort of personal research, interesting project, see what could happen. Also with the potential of maybe being used at wide scale. But that was about it. And then I guess you stumbled on it and started tweeting about it, and
and I wrote a blog post.
Yeah, put me into the Slack channel, and it's been awesome. I mean, I think there's no way that Goa would be what it is today without that community, without all the input. It's not just code; it's the ideas, the requirements, the numerous bug fixes. I mean, that to me was like waking up in the morning and seeing a PR where that fixes a bug I wrote. That's the best thing. I mean, there's no better way to start a day. So yeah, I've been very impressed. I'm very grateful, and it's been awesome.
So it's only appropriate that we talk about that blog post that I wrote, because on this show we have a habit at the end of every show of talking about the Free Software Friday movement that we're trying to portray here, and that was the blog post in, I want to say it was in November of last year, where I mentioned that I had stumbled across Goa and I thought it was just an amazing thing. And I was talking about ways that you could talk to open source programmers and thank them for the work that they do, and tell them that you appreciate it. I think I actually even proposed to you. I'm not sure. Oh, I did. Yeah. On 17 November 2015.
Oh, yeah.
I think I want to marry the guy who wrote Goa.
Yeah.
So I have to apologize if that made you uncomfortable in any way.
No, that made me laugh. That made me have to retrieve my lost Twitter password. Actually, I wasn't on Twitter at the time, and it's a colleague of mine that saw the tweet and told me about it. And I had a good laugh, and I think it's been great. I think it's I really appreciate all the support that you've been giving Goa, and I think again, Goa wouldn't be what it is today without all of that support and all the people now participating into the development of it.
And I know it was probably a few months ago, but you went through a refactoring, right, to kind of support pluggable, to create kind of plugins for stuff. Because I know Brian ended up going through and creating a plugin for ORM integration.
Yeah, I think Goa may have caused Brian to kind of rewrite the same thing 7 times in a row or something like that. And, so sorry about that. But yeah, I mean, it was basically an exercise of trying to make it possible for plugins to be added to Goa at the same time that the big plugin that Brian was developing was being developed, right? So Brian wrote this amazing plugin called Gorma, which allows you to define models in DSL. So now you can not only define your API shapes, but you can also define the database models. And from that, Gorma generates code that will instantiate those models from request bodies and then create response bodies from the model. So it makes it very easy to have a full stack kind of app in a few minutes. So it's awesome. But yeah, I was working on trying to make plugins work in Goa in the same times that Brian was working on Gorma, and so I must have broken Gorma maybe 200 times. I don't know, something like that.
It was a fun process, though. It's okay.
Yeah. And I think the end result is nice. I think I think anybody that now writes a plugin for Goa has to thank you. I think that's that should be the rule.
So what's been the most surprising plugin that you've seen, or the most surprising contribution to Goa?
Well, I think Gorma is definitely up there. It was clearly, once you think about it, it's a use case that's really important. I just hadn't thought about it, and once you think, oh yeah, obviously the next thing you need to do after you get your request payload is to store it. Well, yeah, you're gonna need to talk to some database, and yeah, you could generate code to do that. So I think that has been very interesting, because I hadn't thought about it, and it just makes a lot of sense, and I think it's very useful.
So I guess it's kind of hard to go into detail about the actual DSL itself, because this is all audio based. We could draw stuff on our own individual whiteboards if we wanted to, but I don't think that's going to help the listeners. Yeah. So one thing I would like to talk about, though, is not everybody's kind of familiar with code generation. So I guess one thought process that constantly comes across people when they first hear the idea is, how do you maintain generated code, right? Like if you were to modify it and you need to regenerate, are you wiping over all the top of your stuff? So I'd love to kind of hear you explain kind of like what the model is for maintaining your code that's been generated and if I got a new version of Goa and wanted to take advantage of some new features or plugins, what does that look like for the code that I had to manually write as part of that API?
Right. So the main idea is you do not maintain generated code. Basically, the generated code is generated in its own package, and it's cheap code. You don't have to maintain it. You don't have to test it. You don't have to really know the internals of it. You're welcome to look at them, and hopefully it's understandable, but you don't have to. All you care about is what it provides to you and how it interfaces with your code. Right. So one of the kind of code generation principle behind Goa is that user code and generated code never mix. And there is a very clear interface, an explicit, a Go interface, right? It's a very explicit interface between the two. It's not just one, it's multiple, but the idea is that you have interfaces that are clear between the generated code and the user code. And if you regenerate your code, you shouldn't care. Basically, the idea is if you change your design and let's say you add a new field to a request payload, you regenerate your code. All that means is now your context object has a new field and you can use it, and that's it. You don't have to worry about anything else. Obviously, there are cases where the interface may break. They may change between different tools, but in that case, it should be clear. It should be you're moving from 1.0 to 2.0, and you're doing that consciously. It shouldn't be something that is a side effect. So I've been very careful about that because in the past I've had experience with Corba, IDL, MIDL, and it was always very painful whenever generated code mixed with user code, because now what do? Do you test the whole thing? So do you now own the generated code, right? Do you need to test it, to maintain it? And then you run into the issues of lifecycle. When you change the source, then you need to change that code. So sometimes some MIDL generators would put markers in comments in your file, right? And then they would find those markers and change the code in between, and you were not supposed to change that. So I really wanted to try and avoid running into those issues, and so all the generated code goes into a different package which you do not touch. Actually, you cannot touch it because the code generator will wipe out the entire directory every time. So there's no way that your code is going to mix with the generated code, and the interface is a Go interface. It's explicit, and that's how you both could interact.
So when you say don't worry about testing the code that was auto-generated, part of that code was the controllers. Are you saying, so how is your workflow? Do you test? Do you then go and manually write tests for integration, for functionality, and not specifically? I'm not a huge fan of testing controllers in specific. I'm more a fan of testing integration, but how do you then go and write it manually?
So the controllers that GoAgent generate are this is code that you own. So there's two kinds of code that GoAgent generates. One is the vast majority of the code is things that live in different packages that you don't worry about. But then there's also this scaffolding code, which is kind of just a bootstrap code to help you get started, right? It's not something that you're going to regenerate over time. It's something that you do once, and it helps you quickly compile your service and be able to test it and play with it right away. And so for that code belongs to you. That code, you test it and you maintain it like your code. And actually, next time you run GoAgent, it won't overwrite those files. And those files live in the main package. So the controller lives in the main package, and you test that, you own that. The low-level handlers that get generated by default in the package called app, those are the ones that I'm saying you don't have to maintain, you don't have to worry about.
Got it. And I wanted to say too, in prepping for this episode, I watched a talk that Brian Keltelson gave in Tampa, and it's simply amazing. If you don't know Goa and have any interest at all, the talk is an hour 15, but it's so worth it because he shows the functionalities that Goa provides in Gorma, and then he shows codes. And pretty much I watched the whole talk, and I came away with a very good sense that I understood what Goa does. And I thought it was very simple to use. Another thing that I thought was, I come from a Rails background, and I saw a lot of similarities. To me, it felt like this could very much be an alternative to Rails if I wanted to do a backend app or an API app in Go. And but except that it didn't abstract away a lot of the things. I saw right there what the code was doing, and it was very much under my control, as opposed to just calling it abstractions that maybe I knew or maybe I didn't.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some similarities in the way that you have controllers and you have resources, and so that definitely is similar. I think also one other thing that Go is trying to do is stay simple, right? So one of the things that we've used Rails quite a bit here, and we've got an application probably way too big for what Rails was supposed to be doing, and so we felt a lot of pain with some of the plugins and some of at some point I think we had like more than 100 gems we're using, and so at this point it becomes almost impossible to understand the request flow throughout. And so something I think Go is trying to do is to keep things simple, kind of get the best of Go, right? The Go principles of doing simple tools that do simple things, and can be composed together to achieve what you want, and try to get those ideas and mix them with, at the same time, the practicality, right, of doing something where you don't have to rebuild everything every time. So that's I think that's a nice little, it's kind of two goals that are a little bit opposed to each other, but it's a good tension, and I think Go is trying to strike the balance between the two.
Yeah, my impression was that it was very easy in the sense that when you jump into a Rails app, it's very easy to get going. So it was easy in that sense, but it was also simple. And that's what I was trying to say. In Rails, I'm using a lot of abstractions that maybe I went into the Rails source code and looked at it and I know what it is, but probably I didn't. And with using Goa and Gorma, I see everything right there. I have direct control of what's going on, and it's simple.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm happy you say that. I mean, that was definitely a goal too, is trying to simplify things and kind of hide a lot of the complexity of hooking up, the mux and so in the generated code, and then what you have to implement as the user should be fairly straightforward. Basically, the data structures you have to deal with are the ones that you define in your design. So it should all be very expected and fairly simple to use. Yep.
Now, I have an anecdote about that. In the Goa Slack channel, in the Gophers Slack, we call Raphael the Godfather. And that's because of his extreme dedication to the simplicity of the DSL and the user experience. He will not let anything get by that complicates the process. And I really appreciate that. I think having that laser sharp focus on user experience and developer experience is what makes Goa a great tool versus many of the other code generators, some of which I've written that suck. So that's important. You have to have the Godfather in every project.
Yeah, try to hide all the, keep all the complexity below. You can look at it if you want, but you don't have to deal with it. I think is a very interesting principle. You get developers of, like in a big team, you get developers of every level that need to use your tool. And so I think you need to make it approachable so anybody can take advantage of it and leverage it as best as possible, right? You shouldn't have to know how the tool works to take full advantage of it. I think it's the tool's job to make sure that you can use it in a way that's easy and all the complexity is hidden from you. At the same time, if you are a more advanced user or you are curious and you want to see how it works, it shouldn't be hidden either. And what's underneath should also be fairly nice design and blah, blah, blah. But you shouldn't have to be exposed to the whole thing from the get-go. Yeah.
So another thing that's kind of risen in extreme popularity over the past couple of years is Swagger for doing API specifications. And as I understand it, Goa also generates all the Swagger specs so that you get the Swagger UI kind of for free for anything that you've defined in this DSL.
Yeah, Swagger was definitely a big inspiration for the abstractions in the design. So it's no coincidence that it's the Swagger generation is fairly complete in the sense that you can express anything that you can express in Swagger in a DSL. Actually, the first inspiration was JSON schema. I don't know if you're familiar with how Heroku document their APIs, but they use JSON schema, this kind of recursive JSON schema to describe all of their APIs. And so that was kind of the initial inspiration for the abstractions in the design language. But then it so happened that Swagger is also using JSON schema for a lot of their representation of like what they call the path object. And so that mapping was very easy to do, and it was sort of natural. So yeah, and I think it's great too because that means that people that already know Swagger are already used to thinking about design of APIs will feel right at home. Right, they will have to deal with the same abstractions that they already know. And actually, I think an interesting project or add-on that could be done with Goa is a tool that would take the Swagger definition and generate sort of the Goa DSL, kind of go the other way around, right? So you if you write the Goa DSL, you get Swagger. It'd be also interesting if you had Swagger to be able to go to a Goa DSL, because then you would be able to take advantage of Goa Gen to generate all those other things.
If you started that to you, Brian.
Pardon me?
That's your he's assigning that to you.
I was just going to say, if you started with a Swagger specification and you generated a Goa DSL, and then the Goa DSL generated a Swagger specification, you could set that thing into an endless loop. And by the end of it, it would be Turing complete.
Yes, it would be actually very interesting to see how the Swagger evolves over time, whether it degrades or
or whether it takes over the world and starts launching nuclear warheads.
I have a question for Raphael. The views aspect or feature of Goa, I thought it was super interesting. I remember working with a Rails app, an API that was serving cube data as RESTful resources, and we had to do some filters that were complicated. Once we figured out a pattern, it was we just followed the pattern. It was sort of simple, but then I ended up running with problems because we were using the Swagger documentation tool, Swagger as a documentation tool, not necessarily to design the API, but just to document the API. And so there was a mismatch there between what we were doing and between the specs that Swagger, the Swagger spec, whatever the spec version was that we were using. So now, with query params and filtering features of an API, is that what the views does? Is that like if I have different filtering criteria, I can use different views to represent that? Is that what it is?
Yeah, that's the idea. So the idea is that a single resource may be represented in different ways, right? You may have an index view, for example, that only has a few fields, and you may have a detailed view that has all the fields, and you may have another view that is specialized in some other way. And so the idea is that you shouldn't have to kind of redefine a different media type every time. So you define your media type once, you list all the fields of the media type, and then you define views, different ways of representing that media type. And each view can define arbitrary fields that were defined on the media type. And so, and then how you produce those views from the request is really up to you. So if you decide that you want to use a query string parameter called view, and the name can be either index or expanded, then great, do that. And in your controller, in your code, you basically build a response using the view that you wanted for that value of the query string. So, and that all gets also translated into the Swagger that gets generated as basically different responses for the action. So it's all documented, and you get also the benefit of not having to redefine all those different media types every time.
Yeah, that sounds brilliant, and I bet it's a lot easier to document as well.
Yeah. I mean, it is, and I think people have a sort of instinctive understanding of it, right? It makes sense, right? If I want to index view, then great. It's the same backing resource, it's just different ways of representing it. So I don't think it's a very complicated abstraction, and it does add a lot to the DSL.
Yeah,
so I'd like to make.
Agree with that.
What's that?
I'm just saying I would completely agree with that. I love the idea of views having the same resource represented slightly differently for a different use case. Doesn't mean you should have to write a ton of different code. You just ask for that resource with a specific view.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I'd like to make sure we have kind of time to do a fireside chat, talking about kind of news and projects and stuff we've run across together. So before we move on off of Goa, I'd just kind of like to hear from you, like what's next for Goa? What kind of functionality are you looking to add here in the near future?
Yep. So there are a couple of things first off, I should say that Goa is not 1.0 yet. So I think the near future is going to be finishing 1.0, and we are very close. What I think would make sense is to finish up the security examples that we've started, because that's an area that can get a bit hairier than the other areas, so having good examples around that makes a lot of sense. So finishing those examples, making sure everybody's happy with those, and then I think at that point we'll be ready to freeze and kind of ship 1.0, whatever that means. But the idea is that then that is stable. So if you were waiting for Goa to be stable to use it, there you go. Now you can start using it. And now for moving on for VNext 2.0, I think there's a couple of interesting areas I'm looking at right now. One is extending Goa beyond HTTP. So in particular, I've been looking at gRPC. I think it's an area that I've been asked a lot, and it's also something we are looking at here at RightScale. So I'd like to see what we can do there. It's going to be interesting because some of the abstractions are don't match exactly the kind of HTTP REST abstractions. So we're going to I'm gonna have to come up with some interesting solutions there, but I think it makes sense. And another interesting space is making the DSL engine a bit more flexible. So today we've mentioned it's possible to write plugins, and plugins can define their own DSL, or they can define their own output. But it's a bit more difficult if you want an output from one plugin to affect the output of another plugin, or a built-in generator. So an example of that would be, what if you wanted to write a security plugin, right? And there would be some DSL that you can put in your API description that says, hey, if you need to call this action, then this is the authorization middleware that you need to go through. If you wanted to do that today, it would be a bit difficult because you couldn't modify the output generated by the built-in generator for the low-level HTTP server glue. And so I think that's another interesting dimension to look at in terms of trying to make Go a bit more open and have more people being able to contribute more plugins to it. So this is also something I'm thinking about.
No, this is great. And I mean, I guess so. If anybody wants to keep up with or investigate Goa.design is probably the best place.
Yes,
the GitHub's linked there. And
yes, and the Slack channel. I think there's a Gopher Academy, so gophers.slack.com, and there's a Goa channel there. Yep.
That's right. And you'll be actually speaking at GopherCon this year, and Brian will be speaking at Abstractions about Goa as well, if I'm correct.
That's right. And we have a big announcement for people who might be interested in learning about Goa at either one of those conferences. I talked to the organizer of Abstractions, and I talked with Eric, and we both agreed to do a discount code for both conferences. So you can get $50 off if you book at GopherCon or Abstractions. If you use the code GOTIME, all lowercase with no space in, GOTIME. So GOTIME will get you $50 off either conference if you want to go see Raphael talk at GopherCon or see me talk at Abstractions about Goa. Abstractions.io is the website for Abstractions, and gophercon.com for GopherCon.
All right, so let's do some fireside chat here. News and interesting projects. And we'd love for you to participate. Raphael, jump in wherever and offer your own input or things that you've come across you find interesting.
Great. Yep. Sounds good.
Who wants to kick this thing off?
I'll start. I would like to mention the CLI tool that I found. The author's name is not very clear, but I'm going to say that his repo is mkideal, and the project's called CLI. I love it because the examples are super clear, and there are tons of examples. I did a CLI app at some point in Go. If I had seen this, it would have been so much easier for me to understand how to do it. It also has not only flags, but commands. Seems very clean and neat. So that's my recommendation today.
How would you compare it with Cobra? I've been using Cobra for Goa, but I'm curious.
I thought it was easier to understand and follow. And if I am going to use Cobra today, because I used it before, my first time I used Cobra and Viper. Mm-hmm. Today I would have an easy time. But if it was my first time, this would be so easy. This would have been so easy because the documentation is amazing. Kudos to the project maintainer.
So I just quickly looked at this. So, but it seems like it has kind of integrations for other things. So like you can define a particular argument as a PID file, and it kind of decodes that and gives you a pointer to the file so you can interact with it that way. So it kind of is an interesting approach with these decoders. I'll have to look into this a little more.
Exactly. And you can use you can define your flags as slice or map, and there are the features there.
Oh, that's interesting.
So my addition for this week is the post by Scott Mansfield from Netflix about application data caching. And it is way too in-depth and too long to discuss here, but there are some really interesting discussions about data storage and data structure, Go tools like the Rend project, which is available on GitHub, open source. A very nice and technically in-depth article, just the sort of stuff that I love to wake up to with my coffee. And it even has some RocksDB in there for you, Eric.
Yeah, I love me some RocksDB. Yeah, so I read that post too. It's actually really interesting. Rend is kind of wire compatible with memcached. And basically what they implemented was this proxy almost in between their clients and memcached. And they implemented like an L1 and L2 cache so that memcached was the L1, but obviously they could swap that out. And then they were using RocksDB to communicate with their SSDs as kind of like an L2 cache. And all of this was to reduce their financial costs monthly for their Amazon instances for high memory, because they were storing lots of user data in memory. And so they'd have kind of like the hot data set in a given region, but they'd also have a cold data set. So in case people failed over from another region and things like that. So it's really interesting how much they dropped off. And I love the fact that they're using RocksDB, and there's a lot of people using that now. There's Mongo Rocks was out not too long ago. And one of our other favorites, CockroachDB, they're using RocksDB under the covers, unless they've changed by now, but I think they're still using it. And RocksDB actually comes out of Facebook.
Yeah, I definitely just want to shout out to Scott and the team at Netflix for such a nice and thorough write-up. I know Scott's been dragging the people who will listen, kicking and screaming into the Go world, even though they're a Java-heavy shop. They do have a lot of Go behind the scenes there. They just don't talk about it a lot.
Yeah, and I remember seeing some of the performance metrics. It was something in the neighborhood of like 2 million requests per second, but I think that wasn't fully accurate because that wasn't wired up to back ends. I know when it all said and done, the whole system was something in the neighborhood of like 20 or 25,000 inserts per second. But still, I mean, the amount of performance that we're getting out of this Go proxy is awesome. And we'll link to that in the show notes too, because that is an interesting read. And especially if you're not familiar with kind of RocksDB and some of those things, that's kind of fun. Getting to learn how log structured merge trees work. Cassandra uses the kind of same approach there.
Yeah. So another project that I've been following for a long time, but really only recently has started to mature is Shield from Stark and Wayne on GitHub. You guys may remember Dr. Nick from the Ruby world. He seems to have endorsed Go or embraced Go. And this tool Shield is almost your universal utility knife for backing things up. So you can write plugins to back up Redis. You can back up a database. You can back up a disk. You can back up anything if you write a plugin for it. And Shield, when it first came out, I read the code because there was no description in GitHub, and just tried to guess what it was going to do eventually. And I couldn't figure it out for quite a few months. And now it's matured quite a bit, and it looks to be a really nice tool for backing up all the things.
Yeah, I briefly looked at that. I need to find a use case for it. But yeah, I like the idea that you can kind of wire up where it's pulling the data from and where it's pushing the data to. I need more time.
Yeah, almost like the concept of Heka we were talking about last week. You know, this is Heka for backups.
That's actually a good comparison.
Thanks for saying so.
I have to make you feel better.
After the code reviews I've been through this week, I'll take anything I can get.
So another interesting project that I've seen was the Zap from Uber, which was a structured logging framework that's supposed to have, I think, 0 allocations. So that was kind of interesting.
You know, we're down here in the South, so we can call that y'all, yet another leveled logger.
I really liked the structure part of that system. I remember when I worked again in a Rails app, and we were using Splunk to keep track of our logs. And we had to agree upon a specific way to write our code so that it will be easy to find in Splunk. And then we had to just like put certain keywords and the equal sign and the whatever variable we wanted to look at. And we had to rely upon everybody remembering to do that. So with this structure, it just makes life so much simpler for everybody. Besides the fact that it seems to be very efficient and have a ton of other features.
All right. Anybody have anything else they want to talk about before we kind of go on our merry way?
No, it's been a pretty full show.
Or not so merry for Brian, who's going to get a beat down in his code reviews.
Going back to my code reviews. That's right. Don't tell Blake if he's listening.
So one of the things we like to do when we close the show is just kind of briefly go around and give thanks to an open source project, kind of as you spoke to earlier, Raphael, to kind of to get kind of that feedback from the community sometimes makes your day. So we want to make sure that we're regularly reaching out and thanking people for the things that make our lives easier. You want to kick this off, Brian?
I'll kick it off today. One of my favorite open source tools ever is NSQ from Bitly. I've used NSQ in dozens of projects, and it has never, ever disappointed me. It is blazing fast. It is 100% predictable and reliable, and it's just amazing how much you can do with NSQ in very little code. And I really appreciate the fact that they open source that. It's a great tool.
What is it?
NSQ it's a distributed queue that's incredibly fault tolerant and really fast, and it's written in Go. And it's written really smartly.
Yeah, and so actually, Matt Richardson did a talk in GopherCon 2014 on it. I think the talk was titled something like "Spray some NSQ on it" or something like that.
That's right. Yeah.
But yeah, that should be on GitHub too.
And that video is up on YouTube. Yeah.
How about you, Carlicia?
I would like to mention today item 2, which I'm sure most people already use. If you don't, you definitely should check it out because eventually you will. It seems that everybody makes a transition from the normal terminal that comes with the Apple system to iTerm 2. And especially the 2.9 beta version. I had to download that for some reason that I forgot, and it's been a couple months, and it's amazing. There are a bunch of new features that are very interesting, very useful. I'm just going to say I recommend you leave. It pops up a tip of the day every day, right on the terminal. It's very non-intrusive. We can just hit escape and it'll go away. Basically, leave that on, and you're going to just cover a treasure trove of cool features for your terminal. There, that's it.
Yeah, for when I am actually on my Mac recently, I have the little tips on there. It's because it's been a while since I've explored features added, so I'm letting it annoy me periodically to tell me things that I should be doing.
They've added some really radical stuff to iTerm 2. The latest betas are pretty crazy in terms of the toys that they've added. I'm not sure if I'll ever use them all, but they are impressive.
I get a little jealous because most of the time I work off of my Linux workstation. So, GNOME Terminal, I think, is the current one I'm using, an i3. But yeah, it's not the same. Raphael, do you have a project you'd like to thank?
Yeah, actually, we started using rethinkdb, and it has been very interesting. I stumbled on it kind of by chance and was reading the description, the feature set, and it all sounded good like it usually does. But then what really struck me is how well it fit with the use case that we were after, which was trying to generate events whenever some data was updated. And so rethinkdb has that built in, this idea of subscriptions built in. And it's been a very interesting journey. It has changed quite a bit the way we're thinking about the design for those new services. And so I would definitely recommend people take a look at it if they haven't yet, because it does provide another dimension to how you can design your systems and take advantage of these subscriptions capabilities. So very, very glad that they open sourced that. And something else I wanted to mention, it's not a project, but it's I wanted to give a shout out to other companies that let their employees develop open source projects, right? Because it takes time. It's not, we all have to make a living, and at the end of the day, the companies that allow their employees to develop open source projects are really enablers, and I think we need to thank them for that. And I'm thankful for Raphael, obviously, with Goa, but it's not just I was also thinking about J.P. Robinson at New York Times, doing Gizmo. I mean, there are many examples of people that work in industry and where their company actually pay them to develop open source projects. So I think that's awesome.
And I actually get to cheat because we got to just talk about the Netflix post and RocksDB, and I love RocksDB, so I'm going to give a shout out to them.
That's cheating. That shouldn't even count. We're taking this one off your scoreboard, Eric.
But I mean, it's awesome. I mean, if anybody hasn't played with it, they should. And even just investigating kind of how log structured merge trees work is kind of fascinating. So I think with that, we are, just about out of time. So I definitely want to thank everybody for being on the show, and especially Raphael for coming on and talking to us about generating all the things.
Thank you. This has been great. Thank you very much.
We have the godfather of code generation on the show.
Yeah. No, this has been really great. Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
And we'll have links to everything we've talked about in the show notes, or if you happen to be following us on Twitter at GoTimeFM, most of this stuff should be linked there, or the Slack channel, the Gopher Slack, or GoTimeFM there as well. Yeah, so I think that is about it. And with that, I guess we'll see everybody next week.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.